So over the next couple of weeks we're going to be talking about scheduling, fleet planning, marketing, flight operations, which are more that management aspect of air freight transport. Our focus questions this week are: what are the major internal and external factors that affect the scheduling process? What is the role of the scheduling department in developing and coordinating a schedule planning process? And what are the 4 basic schedule types? What are the main considerations when undertaking the fleet planning process? How has fleet planning changed over the years? And what are the 5 steps in the fleet planning process? Our readings are all from Wensveen this week. So we've got 3 readings there that relate to scheduling and a couple of readings that relate to fleet planning. So the first area we're going to look at today is airline scheduling. Now, according to Bellababa, Adoni and Barnhart, an airline schedule is perhaps the single most important indicator of a business strategy and competitive position. So a statement like that really elevates air scheduling into a key area within the airline itself. So it's brought it up to a strategic level, and what that suggests is that the scheduling department needs to be closely related to all the other areas of management. In particular, it's talking about business strategy, in particular the marketing department. So they go hand in glove in some ways. The marketing department are making decisions around the markets, and the scheduling department are making decisions on the best schedule to meet those market opportunities. The Wensveen goes on to say he defines scheduling as the art of designing a system-wide flight pattern that provides optimum public service in both quantity and quality, consistent with the financial conditions of the carrier. So essentially what he's saying is that the scheduling department is looking at the resources that they've got at their disposal in terms of the fleet, so the aircraft, the type of aircraft they've got in the fleet in terms of whether they're small, medium, large, whether they're wide-bodied, whether they're narrow-bodied, and matching that up with the operational constraints that the airline has in delivering a particular schedule. So, and I guess one of the things about airline scheduling, particularly in regards to the air cargo industry, is that it's got a number of complexities which makes it quite unique from other types of airline. And one of the first aspects in that regard is the traffic flow. One of the things about cargo, which differentiates it from passenger, is that cargo is typically carried in one direction. So all of a sudden you've got the challenge of matching the return trip and ensuring that you've got a suitable payload on return to make that round trip a profitable exercise for the airline. So if you're servicing Asia from both Europe and the United States, you've already got a challenge because of the imbalances of the goods going into Asia and the goods coming out of Asia. So that's something that's quite unique to the air cargo industry. In addition to that, depending on the markets that you're servicing, it's going to be different types of geography. You might be called upon to do transshipment, so you need the right infrastructure in place to do that, or trucking connections. And if you're a cargo airline, you're more likely to, well, a freighter in that case, more likely to take up the advantage of a number of different stops along the way to build up your payload. Another issue, and it's probably the same for passenger as well as cargo, is this issue of making a change on your schedule and the impact that might have on demand. So in most cases, there's a fair sensitivity in terms of a change you might make in your schedule to the demand at the other in response to that. So any changes you do make in your schedule, you're hoping that the demand is going to be at least maintained or also increased. Another, I suppose, challenge faced by air cargo schedulers is that any subtle change that you do make in your schedule is going to have a flow-on effect throughout the network. So if you change the schedule pattern, it's intertwined with other flights, and that's going to change a number of other services along the way. So you need to be mindful of that. That said, this is not done generally on a piece of paper, a hard copy sort of arrangement. Most airline schedulings are based around sophisticated software that can actually have a number of scenarios built into them to enable you to test a range of different options. Another consideration for the air cargo scheduler is that they must meet a number of operational and contractual arrangements that are already in place, and really in many cases they can't be changed. So in terms of the maintenance schedule of your aircraft, you can't change that when it reaches a certain point of hours in use. In addition to that, you'll have contractual arrangements with airports, you'll have contractual arrangements with customers, and they're not easily changed and moved. So that's another consideration if you're thinking about manipulating your airline schedule. Of major importance, particularly if, well, you only probably have to fly 3 hours and you're moving into another, that's west to east or east to west, and you're moving into another time zone. So if you're undertaking your airline scheduling, you need to be very mindful of the time zone changes in regards to your schedule. And it's probably on balance more important for that cargo that's carried on a passenger aircraft than it is for a cargo aircraft. And the reason for that is that I guess for passengers, they don't really want to be arriving at destinations at 2, 3, 4, 5 o'clock. So that just needs to be kept in mind. Obviously, along the way, any changes in regards to aircraft will have an impact on the cargo load factor and ultimately the profitability of the business. So all these are considerations. Not all of them are totally unique to a cargo airline, but a lot of them will impact on a cargo airline. So this idea of coming up with the right schedule, in many ways, if you're just dealing with a couple of aircraft, 4 or 5 aircraft, a couple of destinations, it's a relatively simple type of process, really. It still requires a lot of analysis to make that work. But if you're an airline with 200 aircraft in your fleet, moving to 70 or 100 countries, then all of a sudden the complexity of the challenge gets more difficult along the way. So to do this is this idea of balancing up things at your disposal in most cases, so internal factors as well as some aspects that are external to the organisation which you have less control over. And one of the main areas that you have to really be mindful of as an airline scheduler is this issue around equipment maintenance. Probably close to the most rigid regulation around the use of equipment is an aircraft because of the potential ramifications if it's not done correctly. And what this means is that every single aircraft that you've got in your fleet has its own maintenance plan. So every number of hours that it works up, it goes in for some form of maintenance. Then it gets up to the next level and the next level and the next, and this is ongoing. So your air scheduler needs to be right across the block hours that the aircraft is doing to ensure that it comes out of the fleet at the right time, goes into the maintenance areas to maximise the utilisation of the aircraft itself. So they all have their separate maintenance routing plan. And obviously it's a fair bit of coordination to ensure that this is done to the best overall service. And ultimately, the best overall service is going to be a situation where you're going to minimise the negative impact on profitability of taking that aircraft out of your global fleet. Now, one of the approaches to this idea of equipment maintenance is airlines typically will try and focus their maintenance, particularly for the bigger services, if you like, what's called a D check or even a C check, at fewer stations or fewer airports. So it's a balancing act in many ways, because if you consider that there's a million different parts in an aircraft, for some of those maintenance stations, you're going to have many hundreds of thousands of parts, and that's going to translate into multi-million dollars worth of investment in inventory at those particular locations. So it requires a significant amount of planning on the part of the air scheduler to maximise the utilisation of maintenance across those stations, essentially trying to get a balanced flow. So ultimately, the aim of the scheduler in regards to maintenance is this idea that it turns out a safe and saleable aircraft for every schedule. And this is based on the operational constraints of the airline themselves. In other words, how many planes they've got, how much equipment they've got, and also the personnel to crew not only the aircraft but the maintenance stations and any other equipment facilities. So to that end, in regards to equipment maintenance, there are a number of efficiency goals that they strive for. The first one is to minimise out of service while delivering a high standard of maintenance. Now, that's really that point that I made earlier, is to keep the aircraft in the fleet as long as it possibly can to increase the opportunity for that aircraft to maintain high levels of profitability. The second main efficiency goal is to utilise the maximum time for inspection and overhaul. So they will have specific time periods to undertake that maintenance, and they need to utilise that in the best possible way. And they do that in two ways. One is to ensure that the maintenance personnel are managed in an even manner, so the workflows are evened out, and trying to avoid those peak times, while at the same time maintenance personnel also will have equipment, they'll have tools, they'll have facilities, making sure that they're utilised in a even manner. So that's I guess those two maintenance efficiency goals. Now, as you can see from that particular scenario, this is only going to happen if the air scheduler has got a very close working relationship with the maintenance people themselves. Now, this is an example of a typical type of maintenance schedule. And what it tells you is that at each varying point, something must happen with that aircraft when it's in operation. So every single time the aircraft arrives at a particular destination, somebody will have a visual inspection of that aircraft. Usually it might take around about a half hour. And that's really designed to identify any, I suppose, obvious things that might go on. So that's the first thing that's going to happen. Second thing, that every overnight time that aircraft is at an airport, it's inspected for any ad hoc repairs. And that could take up to 8 hours. So that period overnight is taken up by that maintenance. Now, the first major check, if you like, for an aircraft is called an A check, and that's after 125 hours of service. The aircraft will be pulled aside. It's 8 hours out of the fleet, and some of the key aspects of the aircraft themselves are inspected, such as the fuselage, the engine itself, and some other aspects. The next one is the C check, and I've purposely left out the B check because the B check in the later model aircraft are a lot more advanced than the older aircraft, and the B check has actually been absorbed in to the newer aircraft. So at the C check, that's 3,000 hours. The aircraft is pulled out of the fleet for 5 days. Detailed inspection, engines, fuselage, controls and other mechanisms. And after 20,000 hours, we come up with a D check, and essentially the aircraft is pretty well pulled apart and put back together again. Can take between 15 and 30 hours. So while everything's happening in regards to your arrangements for the air scheduling, each and every one of those aspects of what goes on with a plane also needs to be considered. Now, I found something on Qantas. They say that in a normal week, there's 12 hours of line maintenance per week. So 12 hours of time spent looking at the aircraft. Every 8 to 10 weeks, there's an A check. So pulled out of the fleet for 8 hours. Every 18 months to 2 years, there's a C check. Okay, taking out of the schedule for 5 days. And every 6 to 12 years, there's a D check. Now, the reason why there's a difference between the 6 to 12 years is that the older aircraft, those aircraft that would have been, around for a longer period of time, are going to have to come in for that particular maintenance schedule a lot earlier than the more late modelled aircraft. And if you think about the makeup, and we haven't necessarily spoken a lot about the makeup of an all-cargo airline or cargo airlines, a lot of their aircraft are older aircraft rather than newer aircraft. So they're more likely to have those D checks in around that 6 years. This particular slide is an example of how you might plan out your maintenance facilities across North America. So we're working on the basis that we've got 5 different types of maintenance check, the 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5. And as you can see here, you've got 14 airports or stations, if you like, around North America. All of them are in a situation to do the en route check. But as you get through to the more detailed type of checks, the C check and the D check, there's only a minimal number of stations that would do that. And once again, that's tied in with the fact that you've got multi-million dollars worth of components and parts are tied up in these particular inventories at these stations. So if we have a look at en route, you've got a couple of single airports there. Then you've got the A check, and as you can see, they're strategically placed from a geographic point of view across North America. The B check, similar sort of scenario there. The C check, only a couple of those. And then you've got the D check over there in San Francisco. And not only does each station have to have a detailed inventory of parts and requirements for what they do, they're also going to need a very experienced maintenance team to actually fulfil their requirements. Now, that's maintenance. So you can see maintenance impact on air scheduling is quite significant. Another internal factor that is a big impact on air scheduling is crew scheduling. So in the same way that maintenance needs to maximise utilisation, you're also doing the same with airport crews to ensure that they can meet the requirements of the aircraft as they move from route to route. And I guess one of the big challenges in that regard is the ongoing training of ensuring that the crews are able to deal with the aircraft within the fleet. And that's particularly more of a challenge if you've brought a new aircraft into the fleet. There's quite a significant amount of training, probably less so for the people who are moving the cargo in and out, but more so for the pilots who are piloting those aircraft. When you're dealing with crews that are managing aircraft, the important aspect of that is that you give them enough time to regenerate and adequate rest is achieved along the way. Now, this isn't one of these situations where you make that up along the way. What you find is that crew scheduling, there's a number of limitations that you need to be across. So there's government laws and working conditions that must be heeded. Most aircraft crews are going to have some form of agreement with the airline, more cases than not. So that's going to impact on utilisation. And I guess the other challenge for the air scheduler is that not all your crew is going to be at one location. So they're going to also be spread across the geographic regions that you're going to. So that's another a challenge when you're matching your crew with the various schedules that you're organising. Another aspect outside of the crewing is ground operations and facilities. Once again, it's built around this idea of maximising utilisation of ground operations and facilities because ultimately you're going to be limited by the amount of equipment and facilities at your disposal. Now, in addition to that, every airport that you go to, you'll be dealing with access issues to ensure that you can get a slot at an appropriate time or a location at the gate. When you do get into that airport, the next issue is going to be around the time it takes to actually move the cargo out of the aircraft. And at the same time, you're matching up the crews and the staffing levels to meet the amount of cargo that's coming in, whether you need staff in the cool stores and whether you need staff looking after the equipment that's going to move the cargo in from the aircraft or onto the aircraft. Tied in with this is the fact that you've also got ground equipment that needs to be not only under maintenance, but it needs to be operated by someone. So you've got to have the appropriate crews. There's certain levels that you'll have to meet to make that work for you, managing other cargo vehicles accordingly. Now, I suppose for the air scheduler, the biggest headache for them is going to be this issue at peak times. Now, if you remember, we had a look at the movement of cargo over the course of the year. There's probably only two real peak times, one time in and around April and another time as a build-up to Christmas. So they're going to be the most challenging times for the airline scheduling department itself. And of course, industry growth patterns and market facilities is also going to have an impact on that and what the demand is at that particular time. Now, I guess if we looked at that slide there, what we'd say is that arguably that could be a pattern at an airport in terms of takeoff times and departure times. The air scheduler needs to be across that, but what also compounds that particular situation is the what type of flight it might be. So, for example, it could be a turnaround flight. So the flight's just arrived, quick change, and then it's heading off. It could be an origin flight. That's going to have different ramifications in terms of the loading of the aircraft. It could be a through trip. If it's a through trip, that might make some other differences. And if it's a termination flight. So depending on the type of flight, it also impacts on the scheduling that we can see there, a range of different times associated with the type of flight in the schedule itself. A couple of other internal factors. One is this idea that of flight operations. So other things that the airline scheduler needs to be across is what's actually happening in flight operations. And one of those issues is what airports the aircraft are going to. Every airport has got its limitations. It might only have, there'll be runway lengths that are a consideration. An aircraft, depending on its size, will require an airport with an operational runway length to meet its specifications. Also, aircraft fuel capacity is an issue when they're allocating an aircraft to a particular schedule. So not only does an aircraft carry the fuel to get them to the destination, they'll also carry fuel reserves for safety. So depending on the size of the aircraft, it might, and the requirement to carry additional reserves might mean that it reduces the payload capacity of the cargo, hence reducing the profitability. Also, as an air scheduler, you are going to deal with situations where you've got consistent bad weather. Airports have got consistent bad weather. Chicago, I think the Windy City, they call it in the US, gets 38 inches of snow each year. So in those scenarios, you've got to deal with a situation where you might have delays. And in addition to that, as an airline, you're dealing with the air traffic control, who ultimately is going to have control over whether you land or not at a particular airport, which will perhaps mean that you've got to have a range of contingencies in place if that particular scenario occurred. Now, the final internal factor, and as I said at the start, marketing and air scheduling really go hand in glove. They work very closely. In most cases, you would expect the marketing department to identify the key locations where that particular aircraft is going to travel to meet the requirements of their marketing schedule. So with that in mind, the air scheduling has got to match up with that. So depending on whether it's a short, medium or long haul route, is going to impact on the size of the aircraft, the type of the aircraft. Also, I mentioned earlier, time zones are a consideration in regards to decisions about departure and destination times, as well as decisions around this idea of matching up with multimodal shipments. So if you're undertaking multimodal shipments, and that seems to be a significant area of your business, you've got to make sure that the airports that you're going into have got those linkages to enable access to port or access to trucking facilities or whatever the multimodal shipment might be. So ultimately we see this idea of scheduling being about, and this is I suppose that correlation with marketing, is producing a marketable and profitable timetable. And they're doing that based on the constraints, so the fleet, the maintenance, the crewing and all those sort of things at their disposal. Now, this really is contingent on a few things that have to happen, and firstly, the size and future growth of a given market. Also, the impact of any changes to a schedule or a new schedule on your own share of the market, including costs and revenue. And if you are making changes to your schedule, what might be the competitive response from your competitors in regards to these new plans, and how you might mitigate the response from the competitor at the same time. So ultimately, a major element of the product, if you like, of what an airline is offering is its timetable, and the way it schedules its flights, because it's probably more relevant to passenger travel, but if you think about it, a lot of the decisions that you make over a time of departure is based on what's available by the variety of airlines and what they offer. Another aspect of it, and I've been talking mainly about internal factors, is this idea of external factors. Now, external factors are typically aspects that you actually can't control yourself, that are generally out of your control. And some of those external factors are actually dealing with the airports that you're dealing with. It's incumbent on you as an airline to have a good relationship with an airport, and a lot of that's got to do with the fact that they're vital in control of the availability of access to that particular airport, whether slots are available or not. Also, more and more situations are arising where airports are having curfews and issues in regards to arrival. So Sydney Airport, for example, we've got a curfew of aircraft arrival between 11 a.m. and 6 p.m. Interestingly, that's mainly for passenger aircraft. For cargo aircraft, there is a dispensation if your size is such that it doesn't, and the level of noise is such that it meets the regulation of the aircraft, and they can come in between that 11 p.m. and 6 a.m. Also, other issues in regards to airline scheduling, which are a little bit outside your control, are the contracts that you've got in place. So if you've got a contract in place with a range of contractors to deliver, such as the Postal Service, you're going to find it very difficult to move out of that particular schedule. Other factors could include seasonality, global conditions. Obviously, if you're an airline scheduler, you would be monitoring very closely the trade implications of the China-US trade dispute, because what we've seen in the past is that as countries move into a recession, it has a considerable negative impact on the movement of air cargo. Ultimately, this task of scheduling is pretty complex. As I said, sophisticated software is available, but a vital management task that needs to be interrelated with a range of other management functions of the airline themselves. In terms of the types of schedules, there's 4 main types of schedules, and in many ways these schedules can be dovetailed and interrelated in some ways. The first one is this idea of a skip-stop schedule. So this is a designated path that doesn't stop at all locations. Pretty straightforward. So it's going to typically stop at more of the intermediate airports. So it provides a fast service to intermediate airports along a flight path, but you don't get service to all the airports in between. So that's going to suit some operators rather than others. The other option there is a local service schedule. Now, your local service schedule is typically going to use a shorter range of aircraft, and along a flight path, it's going to stop at every airport along the way. So, including intermediate locations, and that gives them generally an opportunity to move on to a larger aircraft for a longer range flight. Advantage of this one is that it's a fast service for those smaller airports to intermediate airports, and I guess probably the only real disadvantage there is that when you get to those intermediate airports and you want to move on to another destination, you probably have to change planes. And also you're stopping at every airport, so that's also going to be a slower process. Now, the 2 main schedules that are in use is what's called a point-to-point or a non-stop schedule. So this is typically your longer range aircraft going from one point to another and really not stopping along the way. So this is long haul flights in the main. So it's a fast service. And I guess from the perspective of a cargo airline, it presents them with less opportunity to stop at intermediate locations and pick up their some additional payload along the way. So if you were looking at the makeup of cargo carriers, you'd probably say that this is probably a combination or passenger cargo carrier would utilise this with their passenger fleet, less so perhaps the freighters. And the other key is the hub and spoke. Now the hub and spoke is this idea of a number of flights coming in from a number of destinations to a single point. That single point we can call a hub, of which the transfer of cargo and passengers, if you like, will then move on to other destinations. This is a simplified version of the hub and spoke. So you can see here the hub is Chicago, and you've got 6 different locations coming into that particular scenario. And any one of those flights can then move on to any of the other points. So you've got a lot more variety available to you. So that's I suppose, the classic example of the Memphis hub, which is the hub for the integrator FedEx. So as you can see, feeding in and then feeding out. Now, some of the advantages of the hub and spoke, because when we think cargo, we're thinking more about hub and spoke. The first real main one is all of a sudden you are presented with a lot more options in terms of where your cargo can go to. So there's a lot more city pairs. So if we look at a point-to-point scenario, we've got 8 different destinations, but you've only got a total of 4 city pairs using the point-to-point. However, if you utilise the hub in the middle of that, all of a sudden you build up 24 city pairs. So that's, I suppose, the benefit that can come from that hub and spoke type system. You've got higher payload opportunities, so you've got an opportunity to increase the volume of cargo in the aircraft itself, so higher payload. And as a general rule, you're going to be consolidating a lot of these freight shipments or cargo shipments. And that consolidation to the shipper is going to reduce the cost. Greater frequency of flights, as we can see there. It's also going to reduce aircraft flight times in most cases. And it presents an opportunity for greater consolidation of your maintenance, excuse me, and other crews at a central location. So if that's going to be your central point, there's every chance that you'll be able to centralise a lot of those crews and maintenance. Now, it does have some disadvantages. In most cases, at a hub, there's a lot of congestion, and a lot of those hubs, as the volumes, not only of passenger but cargo, increase, there's a limited availability for you to get some access to those hubs. So that's one issue. Look, I think the movement of cargo these days is very sophisticated in terms of handling, but I guess you can't discount the idea that the cargo could be misdirected in a hub and spoke type of arrangement. If you're relying on a hub and spoke, and for whatever reason that particular airport is closed, then you've probably thrown your whole cargo scheduling out of whack, really. But given that Nick has already advised us that Memphis, for example, has 99% good flying weather, choosing the right hub is going to be a key issue in that regard. I suppose the other issue that you have to deal with around hubs, because of the concentration of aircraft, there's going to be some negative environmental impacts at that particular point. And you could argue that there is a level of anti-competitiveness at hub airports. Look, I think that's more associated with the idea that certain airlines are giving greater preference depending on where the hub is. So because FedEx is such a big user of Memphis, they would get first preference for all new opportunities as they came up. And I would imagine in Hong Kong, in and around the hub there, Cathay Pacific are also giving them the first opportunities in and around the hub. Assessment process used by airline management. So in many ways, the airline is constantly evaluating the aircraft that it has in its fleet. So those sort of questions and issues that it needs to clarify relate to issues such as, am I going to buy another aircraft? Am I going to lease another aircraft? If I'm going to buy, is it going to be a new aircraft? Is it going to be a converted aircraft? We're not going to get into too much detail about new and conversion, but these are some of the questions that a fleet planning department are asking themselves all the time. If a decision has been made in regards to buying, then the next step in the process is to make a judgment on what types of aircraft. So, are they going to be small, medium, large, wide body, narrow body? Also, if they are going to bring some more aircraft into their fleet, how many? So, how many are they going to buy? And it's a timing issue. So, I would imagine that many air cargo airlines at the moment would be probably putting on hold the idea of buying new and used aircraft and bringing them into their fleet now, mainly to do with the economic environment that we're dealing with. That said, everything has a use by date. And if you want to continue to be productive, you do need to turn over your aircraft or provide some level of modification, because that's an alternative. It's a cheaper alternative, if you like, than buying a new or used aircraft. And perhaps that might be the option at this particular point in time. Now, when it comes to making these decisions, there's a number of issues which are impacting on that decision. Often they're internal, some of them are external. So the financial situation of the airline is a big determinant on whether they're going to make an investment in aircraft. Also, if they are going to continue with their current line of aircraft, what are the maintenance costs associated with that? Are they going to be offset if they bring in a new aircraft? So instead of having their D check and taking that aircraft out of the fleet for 15 to 30 days every 6 years, they're now doing it every 12 years, which might be a good offset and help them make that determination. One of the things that aircraft have done, but probably not to the same degree, is that they've made improvements on their engines, or their power plants if you like, which has presented opportunities for minimising the fuel costs, which are arguably the highest operational costs of the aircraft itself relate to fuel. So maybe that's a reason why you might choose a new aircraft versus a used aircraft. That said, aircraft has to be available. Often if you're buying new aircraft, you have to go in line, and probably could be 5-8 years before you can expect to get that new aircraft, because you have to put yourself in a queue. Now, if you can't wait that long, then you might have to look at perhaps a conversion option, which might reduce the time for you to get that done. If you're going for a converted aircraft, and typically they are passenger aircraft which are converted to freighters, then an aircraft has to be available. Typically that's a scenario where the passenger aircraft has had its day and they are then phased out of the fleet, and the next option for the passenger aircraft is this idea of a conversion to a freighter. So often this issue in regards to buying or leasing comes down to leasing. Now, we've already touched on leasing on a couple of occasions. One of those leasing options is what they call dry leasing. So dry leasing is leasing just the aircraft. So in the US, there's been some major change in tax reform which has driven a lot of airlines towards dry leasing. And the first one was elimination of investment tax credit and reduction of allowable deductions for tax income for depreciation. Essentially what they are is, in the past you could buy an airline and you could offset those costs in your tax. So you're minimising the tax that you're paying. Anyway, those loopholes over time have been changed, and now there's a stronger movement towards leasing. Not all the time, but certainly for some of those, I guess, smaller to medium type carriers. Now, if you were going to take a lease, there's a couple of different options there. The first one is what's called an operating lease. So the operating lease works on the basis that the lessor retains the aircraft for its lifetime. So at the end of a given period, the lessee doesn't take the aircraft. It's just a leasing model only. And in that regard, the lessor bears any issues in regards to market risk as to its value over time. The other option is where at the end of this lease period you want that aircraft in your fleet, and when you go through that leasing payment cycle you then get the aircraft. So there's two different approaches that you might take to that. Now that little asterisk there is just a point to say that just be mindful that with a dry lease, it's aircraft only. You have to supply your own crew, supply your own maintenance, supply your own insurance. And what probably isn't there, you also have to market and any other operational costs that go with it. Of course, the other option to leasing, and we're not spending a lot of time on this, but this is certainly a viable option in regards to fleet planning, is this idea of a wet lease. And that's the other end of the continuum, if you like, and this is where you're getting the aircraft, you're getting the maintenance, you're getting the insurance and the crew, all included, plus you're also getting the owner certificate as well. The pros to a wet lease is, if you think about it, if you have to take an aircraft out of your schedule, then all of a sudden during to be maintenance or grounded, then you've got another aircraft that you can substitute. So you don't necessarily lose too much out of that particular process. If it's a peak season and you believe that you need some extra aircraft, then you can lease. And for a relatively short space of time, it's not cheap, but it's going to be a lot cheaper than you investing in a new aircraft. Another pro to the wet lease is that it's certainly that lower cost option to purchasing new and converted aircraft, which I just said then. Now the cons of a wet lease are really mainly around this issue that it attracts regulatory interest. So the regulatory authorities in a country are going to be pretty aware of other countries coming in using that aircraft, particularly if they're coming from countries where their standards aren't as high as that particular country. So they're going to be very mindful that those airlines taking advantage of this opportunity are meeting all the requirements of that country's regulation. Now, over time, fleet planning has gone through a range of different I suppose, phases and changes, and you could argue that it's probably in two parts. The first part is pre-deregulation, and we use, I suppose, the yardstick for deregulation is about 1980, and that's particularly when deregulation occurred in the United States. And then you've got post-deregulation. So pre-deregulation, it was a pretty good situation for most airlines that were operating during that particular time. It was heavily regulated, but there was a high level of certainty in regards to how business was conducted. It really wasn't highly competitive, and if you had a particular route structure, you could stick to that route structure, and you could probably make a reasonable profit over a period of time. So there was a level of predictability around the costs associated with doing business, and also the revenue that you were getting in. You couldn't vary your revenue. That was set by government. So you knew what government was going, and you would match that with the, I suppose, the resources that you had at your disposal. You also had a fair confidence in cargo traffic growth. So cargo traffic growth was growing quite well over that period. It was a steady rate, and also you were also able to take advantage of the fact that this was a period of time where a lot of new aircraft were being brought in. So there was a fair bit of innovation happening, which is also leading to better payloads for the cargo carrier, because they were getting bigger aircraft, certainly in the belly hold, to carry cargo, so higher payloads. If, in that particular scenario, if the airline got into any situations where perhaps financially they were having some difficulties, the government was there essentially to hold their hand. They had a safety net, and they would come in and facilitate some form of arrangement that gave you an opportunity to continue trading. And a lot of that related to things such as mergers. When it came to airlines in terms of their own productivity, they were more interested in perhaps the technical considerations in regards to the airframe and engine improvements over time, rather than perhaps what was happening in their own approach to business. So it was more about, okay, we can get a new aircraft, it's going to give us greater payload, this is going to improve our profitability, without looking at other aspects of the airline. So ultimately it was very much a production orientation. So there was no real marketing focus or marketing orientation. Now, that changed post-deregulation. So post-deregulation, which as I said is around about 1980, all of a sudden the government stepped out of control. So it moved away from setting fares, setting market entry, setting routes. The government left that particular situation. So that created a situation where it was open marketing, if you like. So an opportunity for businesses to identify niches, come in with new product options. And it was exacerbated around this time by very high fuel inputs to a lot of the aircraft. Now, over time, the main emphasis for the airlines was on getting a new aircraft. It wasn't so much on productivity in other areas of the business. There were too many issues with fuel costs. However, a lot of those businesses were running 3 and 4 engines, and they became unprofitable when you added in those increased fuel inputs. Also, because it became open in terms of new business models, you had low-cost carriers coming into the marketplace. Now, particularly in the United States, the low-cost carrier pretty well revolutionised cargo and probably made the United States what it is today in regards to the dynamics of cargoes. So previously, passenger airlines were carrying cargo in the belly hold. The aircraft themselves were large enough to carry significant payloads. But what the low-cost carrier did, they weren't interested in cargo at all. They didn't put any emphasis on cargo because that's where the money really didn't reside in regards to an airline. The money resided in passenger aircraft and passenger throughput. And there was a big increase in volume of passengers over this particular period of time. So this really put the other passenger airlines who'd been in the market for a long period of time and who were trying to juggle cargo and passenger really under a difficult situation, because the low-cost carriers, they weren't worrying about, they had lower costs in terms of their ability to market themselves in the market. The outcome of this was that the other passenger airlines in the marketplace also forgot about cargo. They just wanted to concentrate their competition on passengers, which left a gap in the market for somebody who wanted to come in with the right business model to take advantage of that. And using the hub and spoke system in the United States and the focus on this idea of overnight cargo and reliability, they soon, and soon's a relative word really, came to dominate the market. So they took their share from about 1978 from 5% up to around either 60 or 70% of what it is over the last 30 or so years. So just a different machination about that particular market. Now, a couple of other things that have impacted on fleet planning along the way is this idea of fleet rationalisation. Now, fleet rationalisation is this idea, as a result of deregulation, there are quite a number of mergers and consolidation. So this is two airlines getting together and having a look at the aircraft that they've got in their fleet. So one of the most cost-effective approaches to dealing with all those aircraft is that if you only had one aircraft type, you've got a better chance of minimising your maintenance costs than if you had to carry two lots of parts and components for different aircraft. So over that period of time, commonality of aircraft, engines, maintenance parts, instruments, essentially resulted in cost savings along the way. Of course, it wasn't necessarily all about cost savings. In some situations, and you can imagine the pressure on American carriers to use Boeing or carriers in Europe using Airbus, that also, I suppose, changed, influenced the decision around what aircraft to choose. Also, this consolidation, if you like, of one particular airline in your fleet provided some level of interdependence. They're effectively signing up to a particular airline manufacturer, aircraft manufacturer. So there's a strong interdependence with what they do and what you do. And to make this model work, aircraft essentially were staying in the fleet longer, the same aircraft in the fleet longer, and a longer cycle of aircraft replacement. Now, I suppose the only reflection on this idea of consolidation and the fact that you hold on to your aircraft longer and you've got a longer cycle is that when the time comes round to buy your next aircraft, you're actually looking for ways to minimise the costs associated with that. And you could argue that aircraft manufacturers in recent years have been more focused on providing aircraft with perhaps that are more priced better priced, reducing aircraft prices, if you like, rather than having significant innovations, if you like. So if there was a innovation ratio, you'd say it's probably higher up in the 80s rather than in the 90s and 2000, perhaps. That's one issue. And I guess the only other issue in regards to fleet planning, what we've said is that for the air cargo carrier, typically the hub and spoke system is a good approach for them. It works better. You've got cargo coming into one point, you've got the consolidation of the cargo there, and you've got increased payloads. Longer range aircraft is changing that dilemma a little bit because it's presenting opportunities to actually bypass a lot of those hubs, getting the goods into the marketplace in perhaps a lot quicker than the other option, which might present some point of difference, if you like. My feeling is, though, that's going to be a better option for a passenger carrier than a freighter carrier, because the freighter carrier is not so, I suppose, focused on the getting the goods to the location. Certainly speed's important, but if it can pick up some cargo along the way, that's going to work in the cargo carrier's favour. And the last little factor probably influencing fleet planning were issues in regards to noise and pollution. And these, we're going to talk about environmental impact on air cargo in our last lecture, but it's certainly a critical issue for anybody who's got older aircraft in their fleet. So if you've got older aircraft, one of the issues about those older aircraft is a lot of them can't meet the new requirements around noise and pollution. So in that regard, and your situation, if you're a passenger cargo, your option available for an older aircraft is you could have it converted to an all-cargo carrier. So that's one option available to you. Also, you find that these new regulations in regards to noise and air pollution are not as high in developing countries as they are in developed countries. So you often find that the older passenger fleet will gravitate to some of the less developed countries. And of course you've got that option for a re-engineering program, which might require you changing the power plant, so you bring in another engine that meets the requirements of the new regulations. So that brings us to a point where there is a process, if you're going to undertake a fleet planning process, which is quite strategic in nature. And I'm just going to step you through. There's 5 steps in this particular process. One's an information gathering, planning models, evaluation, presentation and approval, and financial evaluation. So probably the most intensive element to this planning process is the informational phase. Because ultimately you're only as good as the information you can gather and put into some computer program or a model which is going to give you a level of guidance in terms of what your fleet might look like. So that requires aligning things such as profitability, load factors, market share, gathering information on your current resources, and it's all orientated towards the fleet. So fleet inventory, financial and technical data, maintenance and flight crews. Also, you need some projected industry environment, so you have a look at the external analysis, and also you have a look at what's happening in your own business, the internal environment. And ultimately, you match that up with that marketing strategy or business strategy that you're going to take. Now, operating costs of an airline are one of the most key inputs at this particular point in the process, and often end up being one of the most deciding factors in your final decision on what aircraft you're going to choose. Now, when it comes to operational costs, there's a range of government information that you can get on that, and a range of bodies that can offer you that information. We're going to touch on that in a lecture coming up in not too distant future. Now, once you get to that particular point, you spend a lot of time gathering that information. You're going to sit down and you're going to put all that information into a computer. That sounds reasonable. I don't think you'd expect it to happen anyway. And essentially, at this particular point in time, you're not going to put any constraints on what the makeup of your fleet is going to be. So no constraints at this point. It's open-ended, putting in all that information, all the information that you gathered. At that particular point in time, you're going to get a range of aircraft based on open, not in consideration of any constraints. You're going to have a list of aircraft to choose from. However, that might be in a perfect world. We're not in a perfect world, so you need to put in some of your own constraints to ensure that the options available to you are going to be consistent with what you can actually deal with. So you're going to have external constraints, which might be your facility requirements at airports and also government regulation. And then you've got your internal. So you're going to have your own profitability. So things like profitability, things such as the number of crew, the number of maintenance stations, all those issues go into that decision-making process about what you can ultimately purchase or whether you lease. At this point in time, so you've gone through that stepping process, you're going to get an output of shortlisted potential freighters with a detailed cost and revenue analysis at your disposal, based on a range of different scenarios. You know, whether it's you're going to use them for short, medium or long haul, what the cargo capacities are available of, and what the direct operating costs are. Now, each of those aircraft then has to be piece by piece evaluated in terms of some key aspects. One of those key aspects relates to its design. So what you need to know are the dimensions of the aircraft, what its weight profile might be, fuel capacity, power plant, so engines, seating configuration, if it's a passenger, containers and pallets, bulk and total volume. So every airline is going to have different characteristics around all of those elements. So you need to understand those before you can make a final decision on whether that aircraft is the right aircraft for you. Also, apart from the physical aspect, the design aspects, you also want to know about the performance of the aircraft. So what's its payload range? Because that's going to be important for you in regards to perhaps the routes that you're servicing. Takeoff and landing data, cruise and approach speeds, runway requirements, and noise performance. Runway requirements, you might have a short list of airports that you go into. That's got to meet the requirements of the runways at those airports, so that might be a consideration. And of course, noise performance that's a situation that's increasing in regulation, so you want to be right across that. In addition to that, and we're still doing the aircraft evaluation, you want to know what the availability is of spare parts. So, maintenance issues. Is the aircraft compatible with the rest of your fleet? So this goes to this issue of commonality. All of a sudden you bring a different aircraft in your fleet, you then have to then provide the parts and components to service that particular aircraft. What sort of product support? Is that a manufacturer that's going to support you well? What sort of training support? And then we start getting into some of those key issues that ultimately probably have a big call on whether you're buying this aircraft. How much is the aircraft going to cost? What about the spare parts? What about the ground equipment? Maintenance and flying training required? And what's the revenue potential? So at that point in time, you're probably very close to a situation where you can, with a fair bit of confidence, make a decision on the aircraft that you want to add to your fleet, as well as direct operating costs. So the last two elements are, it's got to go through a financial analysis to make sure that that's as it should be. You will then make some recommendations, which will most likely go to a board, a presentation and management approval. At that point in time, you might be very close to a situation where you can bring some new aircraft, whether they're new, converted, into your fleet. Now, just a little example on how that can work or not work for you. So Cargo Lux, there's a study done in 2007, were considering upgrading their older Boeing 747-200 freighters to the Boeing 747-400 freighters. So they'd had their 200 freighters in their fleet for a considerable period of time, and they were looking at this other opportunity for themselves. They did a comparison, and what they found is that on pretty well every single element, the Boeing 400-F freighter was ahead. It had 15% less fuel consumption, 12-tonne higher payload, one less crew number, less technical stops, lower maintenance, so it's got every single thing. At the bottom though, there was lower ownership costs and higher ownership costs. I suppose if you were looking at both of them, you'd say at this point, this is the only thing going for the 200F, is the lower ownership costs. And that's really all about the investment that the airline has to make in that particular aircraft. You can see the compelling reasons why that would be something that you would want to bring into your fleet, but as usual, that scenario in regards to ownership costs and investment so adds just that level of complexity to the decision. So ultimately, as you can see there, it's this pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages. It's determining the trade-offs between modernising your fleet with or sticking with your current fleet, some form of modification. Now, in Cargo Lux's case, as you can see there, on all of those elements that were pulled out, such as payload, fuel load, maintenance cost was in favour of a new aircraft, as you would expect. I suppose that's a fair comment. So it also presented with opportunity to access larger shipments and a faster turnaround. So it has a lot of things in its favour. In addition to that, it ticked the box for commonality. So it's bringing the benefit of having the freighter model similar to other models that it's got in its fleet. We could also see that there were cost savings by virtue of economies of scale in terms of maintenance and fuel costs and crew costs. ultimately the ability of the airline to manage the capital requirements of the transaction was the deciding factor. And in the end, Cargolux stuck with the more unproductive option of the 200F, which in retrospect, if you think about the time they were making this decision, rates of air cargo were higher than they've ever been before. So you probably have to say they dodged a bit of a bullet there, because only a year later the whole air cargo market collapsed and many freighter businesses went out of business. So today we looked at the major internal and external factors affecting the scheduling process. We looked at the role of the scheduling department in developing and coordinating the schedule planning. We looked at the 4 basic schedule types, main considerations when undertaking the fleet planning process, how the fleet planning has changed over the years, pre-deregulation and post-deregulation, and what the 5 steps of the fleet planning process are.